5.
Hello, folks. My name is David Fancy. I am professor and chair of the Department of Dramatic Arts in the Marilyn I. Walker School of Fine and Performing Arts at Brock University in Niagara in Ontario, Canada. And a sincere welcome to everyone to this weekend of panels on the subject of theater pedagogy in an era of climate crisis. With this first introductory panel framing some key issues at stake, featuring my colleagues here, Beth, Osnes, Derek Davidson, Lara Aysal, and Katrina Dunn, whom I will introduce more thoroughly in a moment. But their full bios are also available in the notes section of this YouTube page. Just click the show more buttons, please. So I'll begin, though, by drawing attention to Brock University's land acknowledgement. This is an expression of my institution's commitment to decolonization and to indigenization. But it's also a very relevant gesture and statement to the many of this weekend's discussions about humans' relationship with the earth and theater's role in mediating this. So this is the land acknowledgement. Brock University acknowledges the land on which we gather is the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe peoples, many of whom continue to live and work here today. This territory is covered by the Upper Canada Treaties and is within the land protected by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Agreement. Today, this gathering place is home to many First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples, and acknowledging this reminds us that the great standard of living here is directly related to the resources and friendship of Indigenous peoples. And so with that, a little bit of history about the initiative leading up to this weekend. A number of years ago, I collaborated with a large group of artists, intellectuals, researchers, and teachers to develop resources around acting training and diversities. One of those people was Konrad Alexandrovich, the co-convener of this weekend's symposium. He then came to me 2 years ago and suggested a book project that ended up becoming Theater Pedagogy in the Era of Climate Crisis, coming out with Routledge in just a couple of weeks. Many of the panelists this weekend are part of this book. We're also very fortunate to have the participation of a number of other internationally recognized artist, intellectual, researcher, teachers in theater pedagogy and the environment. They've graciously offered to give their time and expertise this weekend to extend the themes in the volume through this public forum. With humility, we recognize that the volume is but one node in a complex global network of urgent research, practice, advocacy, creativity, artistry, and, important for our focus this weekend, teaching of theater, necessary for our field and art forms to engage the climate crisis in all of its complexity. We're also grateful for the support of the Marilyn I. Walker School of Fine and Performing Arts and funding from the Walker Cultural Leaders Series, with special thanks to David Vivian, Gillian Meinecker, Gilgan Doran, Michelle Mohammed, as well as Gavin Farron and Molly Lacey here with the Department of Dramatic Arts. We've organized the weekend's discussion around themes that people from various subdisciplinary areas in theater will converge on, with this introductory session now, a panel later today on eco-aesthetics in performance and design, and sessions tomorrow in eco-literacies in teaching theater, as well as a final session on intersectionality, solidarity, and the body of the earth. Each panelist will speak for about 5 minutes about their work, and then discussions will serve to extend the issues between the panelists. For those of you watching live, please feel free to drop questions in the YouTube chat, and we'll make sure we address these later in the session when the discussion portion opens up. With that said, I'll now speak for a moment, this is my couple of minutes, about, and I'll invite my colleagues just to stay here because it's really important that we recognize this is a collective enterprise. For a moment, I'll speak about some key framing themes that as a group of authors in the volume, but those of us beyond, together wrote as a manifesto for theater education in the era of climate crisis. A manifesto that's available in its entirety in the book, but also in the web pages associated with the symposium. One of the themes that comes up in the volume, other scholarship, and in practice, is the idea of an expanded intersectionality. Issues of racial minoritization and gender-based violence are deeply tied into human-centric, speciesist sense of supremacy over the body of the earth. This form of supremacy thinking facilitates and indeed demands the continued objectification and extraction of the earth's resources by greed-based economic practices, even those dressing themselves up as green or sustainable economic practices. We ask ourselves, how can theater practice and the teaching and learning that informs it resist and respond to such dynamics? Sort of one way into the conversation. Another key theme is teaching and learning strategies that emphasize developing students' ability to have the agency and to feel empowered in their ability to be change makers and create work and circumstances that respond to climate crisis. We note and observe the sense of climate grief and existential dread of young people all over the planet coming to the consciousness of what the climate crisis and the human-induced sixth major extinction event of our planet's 4.4 billion year history, what this means to them emotionally, spiritually, psychologically, socially, their career choices moving forward, how they live their lives. And so questions emerge, such as how can our programs, courses, and teaching strategies be responsive to the lived experience of extremists that we and our students are living with in this era of climate crisis. So another way into this issue. The discussions around teaching theater in an era of climate crisis often advocate for advancing a rich and varied eco-literacy within our theater programs, drawing on notions of an affirmative planetarity, biophilia, or love of nature. But then the debates also often challenge a simplistic understanding of what can be understood to be a somewhat false distinction between nature over here and culture over there that perhaps contributes to some of these crises in the first place. Instead, so much of the practices engaged with here promote the understanding of a deeply entangled relationship between the human and the other than human. A corollary to this work, as we'll discover through these discussions, is to problematize reductive perspectives on representation and mimesis that are integral to many theater cultures globally currently. Questions then become, how do we understand, engage, and then tell or co-tell the stories of the earth? A final question that we might ask ourselves, and a final sort of framing consideration, there are many more that will come out, but I just wanted to close with this one. Despite the urgency of the climate crisis, or indeed, in fact, because of this urgency, many artists, intellectuals, instructors in the field of theater, performance, and climate and environment more broadly also speak importantly in various ways to the continued significance of core principles of curiosity, inquiry, creativity, taking time, and also allowing ourselves the ability to explore and to fail in our attempts to create a range of teaching learning moments, theater and performance practices that can fully engage the climate crisis, right? Even under the duress of a crisis, how do we preserve and cultivate those important spaces of creativity, of exploration, from which important responses will continue to come? How do we engage the crisis without always acting from a space of crisis that might only continue to perpetuate the problem? So these are sort of four areas and framing considerations that have emerged continuously throughout the fields that we're engaging over the course of the weekend. They certainly emerge in the book, and they're things that come up in the manifesto. So with these framing observations now in place, I'd like to begin to turn things over to my colleagues here. We'll continue with our presentations and open out to discussion. So you'll see, dear audience, what we intend to do here is we'll disappear and we'll turn things over to individuals, and then I'll come back and introduce the next person, and then after a little while, after about 20 minutes or so, we'll come back in and we'll continue to discuss. So we're going to proceed alphabetically, and I'll begin with Lara Aysal. Welcome, Lara, and thank you so much for all of your contributions and being here today. So Lara is a climate justice and human rights activist, performance artist, and facilitator of community-oriented projects. Her work mainly focuses on migration, ethnic minority conflict, and climate crisis. She's one of the co-founders of AA+A Contemporary Performance Research Project and Ray Performance Collective. She's provided acting classes at Beykent University. She's interested in the role of theater for being able to address, organize, and take action within climate justice context through decolonizing methodologies. Lara recently completed her artist in residency at Greenpeace Canada and International Study of Arts for Social Change. She's currently a PhD student at the UBC Interdisciplinary Studies program. Thank you, Lara, and turning things over to you.
Thank you very much, David. I'm so happy and really glad that I'm here today. And at the moment, I'm in the unceded and traditional territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. And I'm really grateful to be welcomed here because I'm from far, far away lands, from Anatolia, from Turkey. And yeah, I'd like to briefly talk about my research and my chapter. So in this research process, I aim to explore oppositional performance disciplines by asking to what extent bringing a variety of voices from university and community settings together around a curriculum could facilitate an opportunity to build radical utopian spaces within public institutions. And I borrow radical utopian spaces within public institutions from Denson and Lincoln. In this research proposal, I frame radical utopian spaces as places of coming together within public institutions, such as educational and community settings, and I attempt to build oppositional performance pedagogies by opening a discussion about how such utopian spaces could be built using the tools of applied theater for discussions on climate crisis. I believe that climate crisis demands radical change. And as David put it very well, Louis also points out that exponential growth based on capitalistic logic is what is threatening human life on this planet. And we are facing a crisis of civilization that demands radical change. So focusing on taking action towards radical change in post-secondary theater education, I believe it is necessary to move beyond what we know about climate crisis and start building pedagogical dialogues to create opportunity within public institutions for previously unheard and silenced voices. Of course, we all know that Western knowledge has been at the center of the public institutions and how we approach climate crisis as well. But partnership between art and different knowledge systems, such as Western as well, and indigenous knowledge systems could provide an opportunity to imagine, organize, and take action in building capacity for adaptation and climate crisis. So apply theater as a process of live, collaborative storytelling can become a medium for dialogue between Western and indigenous pedagogies that could build collaboration for action on climate crisis. In this process, I employ the guidance of Etaptmuk two-eyed seeing approach, defined by Elder Albert Marshall from the Mi'kmaq Nation. And I quote, two-eyed seeing Etaptmuk is to see from one eye with the strength of indigenous knowledges and ways of knowing, and for the other eye with the strength of Western knowledges and ways of knowing, and to use both these eyes together for the benefit of all. End of quote. I ask how students and communities could utilize tools of applied theater to bring Western and indigenous knowledge systems together as a form of radical action on climate crisis with this approach. And as a summary, in my chapter, In Search for Radical Utopian Spaces, I go over 3 stages. So first, I discuss the eco-pedagogical approach to climate justice, education, praxis, especially focusing on cognitive praxis. And of course, this is first and foremost the Western approach. So I look at its criticism from a non-Western perspective as well. And secondly, I bring applied theater into the conversation as a collaborative tool for bringing together Western and Indigenous ways of knowing that could facilitate collaboration for action on climate crisis adaptation. And third, I address the topic of actual curriculum design, taking into consideration the limitations of mainstream science to deal with the diversity and complexity of climate crisis, and the need to connect knowledge with action. I explore ways to invite two-eyed seeing, a Taptumuk approach into the conversation and try to build a transdisciplinary framework for this curriculum. And to conclude, it is, of course, evident that the complexity of climate crisis brings a high degree of uncertainty about what the future might bring. It is important to acknowledge that this is a critical moment in history that fosters an opportunity for people all over the world to share, practice, and learn from each other about ways in which we can take action towards alternatives, to transform current realities into collaborative processes of positive change. And I believe and am in the process of trying to explore ways of doing this through oppositional performance disciplines and radical utopian spaces through applied theater in university and public space arena. So that is all from me. Thank you very much. Looking forward to your questions. Back to you, David.
Thank you so much, Lara. A lot of really stimulating things there, and a fantastic way to sort of get us going around the work of recognizing intersecting knowledges, the relationship between knowledge and action, curriculum development. So a lot of great things to come back to there. Thank you so much. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to actually bring up my screen and share a 5-minute video from Derek Davidson. And I'm just going to read his bio for you. He was unable to join today, but is very much here both in spirit and in Zoom recording. So Derek Davidson teaches playwriting, dramatic literature, and theater history at Appalachian State University. Davidson is also artistic director of Invisible Theater, a professional company in Boone, North Carolina, a playwright, director, and AEA actor. Derek's worked as an associate artistic director and coordinator for the Appalachian Festival of Plays and Playwrights at the Barter Theater in Virginia. Davidson is co-facilitator of the university-wide Climate Stories Collaborative, for which he has conducted several forum theater workshops. His short play, Blackjack, has been performed internationally as part of the Climate Change Theater Action. And so, indulge and permit me here to do a little bit of screen sharing. Share with sound. Here we go, expand, and I'm going to play this, and he's going to talk about his work in forum theater.
Hello. First, I want to thank Dr. David Fancy and Konrad Alexandrovich for including me in this wonderful project. I want to express my excitement at finding myself among so illustrious a group of artists, scholars, and writers. I'm grateful, humbled, inspired to be part of this. The subject of my chapter is how forum theater might be incorporated in pedagogy, aiming to expand knowledge of and conversations about climate change. Specifically, people are clearly worried about the future of the world and the effects of human-induced climate disruption, but not enough of us are actually discussing it. In fact, many don't really know how to begin to discuss it. Well, That's the beauty of forum theater, which is a fun, accessible way to get people to engage with the issues and perhaps even come together to begin collaborative problem solving. Forum theater, one of a number of theater games developed by Brazilian director Augusto Boal in the 60s and 70s, is an improvisation game that first gets people's guard down, then helps them engage in ways that can lead them to taking substantive actions in real life. The thing is, you don't need to be a trained actor in order to play. In fact, the book he published compiling these games together, he titled Games for Actors and Non-Actors, to underscore that they are for everyone. So I began incorporating forum theater in my classes and guest lectures on environmental studies. I used it in workshops for faculty, even theater workshops consisting primarily of theater students. Keep in mind, the game itself is open and can accommodate virtually any scenario, tackle any issues. Although, as I say, I've used it primarily with issues of climate change. But now, the rules of the game, quickly. Don't worry, I describe the rules in more detail in my chapter. Okay, since this is an improvisational game, it depends on a scenario. So, first thing one must do is construct a basic story with a beginning, middle, and end, with characters, a conflict, etc. Here's an example. A businessman representing the fracking industry approaches an Ohio family to purchase drilling rights on their land. Maybe the daughter's really opposed to it and the father's for it. Maybe the mother's for it, the father against it, etc. You see. Characters argue it out and come to some sort of ending, if not an entirely satisfactory ending, because you will want to fold into your scenario a mistake. That is, something that the audience will very likely disagree with. The story's too seamlessly constructed. No one will be compelled to want to fix it. So then you cast it. Most of the time, I've arranged participants into groups of between 4 and 5 people. And after rehearsing your scenario, you perform it for the whole group twice. The first time is to give the audience the experience of the piece. And the second, this is where the forum begins, involve the entire audience, not just as passive spectators, but as participants, or the word coined by Boal, spectators. So when watching the performances, the spectator should be open to those mistakes that had been consciously placed. For example, from the above scenario, if the daughter acquiesces to her father too easily, well, a spectator might disagree with that action. At this point, the spectator can yell, "Stop!" and everyone in the scene freezes. This is the crucial moment for Boal's forum theater, because at this moment, the spectators, rather than just explaining what's wrong with what they see on stage, replace the actor and act it out themselves, thereby transforming themselves from mere spectator to spectator. The previous actor, in this case the daughter, sits in the audience, and the new actor plays the scene the way the daughter, according to that spectator, should be played. So the scene can continue, spectators can keep shouting "stop" and replacing actors until the audience agrees on a resolution to the scene. Okay, I have used this game among faculty, students, all theater people, no theater people. I've played it with groups deeply engaged in climate change issues, groups who knew nothing about climate change. The makeup does not matter. Forum theater works every time. Finally, some discoveries I've made. Most importantly, forum theater is fun. 2, because it's so much fun, it's so non-judgmental, it makes people comfortable and opens them to conversations, perhaps conversations they've never actually had with anyone. 3, it can even inspire participants to take action, or at least more actively participate in climate change initiatives in their own communities. Finally, it empowers people. This is the secret that pushed creator Boal to take his forum theater all over the world. If you practice even pretending to do something, for example, standing up to a businessman trying to sell you on fracking, you are more likely able to do it in real life. Participants in forum theater are rehearsing while playing to participate more actively in combating the effects of climate change. It's exciting to see, and it's a real fun thing to be a part of. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you, Derek. If you happen to be watching today, very lovely to have your intervention and some really important articulations there of the translation from playful exploration into action. I think that's something that is of significant concern to many people working in this area. So I look forward to unpacking that further in the discussions. I'd like to invite Katrina to join us. Katrina Dunn is, or rejoin us. Katrina Dunn is assistant professor at the University of Manitoba's Department of English, Theatre, Film, and Media, where she teaches in the theatre program. Katrina's scholarly work explores the spatial manifestations of theatre, as well as eco-critical theatre. Her long career as a stage director and producer has had considerable impact on the performing arts in Western Canada and has been recognized with numerous awards. Malus fusca is a North American species of crabapple tree, the singular tree that contributed to the chapter that Katrina contributes to the volume that we're releasing. And in a very lovely way, she issues the Malus fusca as her co-author. The very singular tree that contributed to this chapter has its roots in Fort Garry in Winnipeg, Manitoba. Thank you so much, Katrina, and over to you.
Thank you so much, David. So happy to be here and to be part of this. So we are speaking today from Winnipeg, the original lands of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and the homeland of the Métis Nation. This chapter is called Co-Producing Mimesis. This has been our exploration, and it asserts that to move theater in the direction of the activist change that our climate crisis requires, and to better speak to our future students, we need new tools, and that one of these should be a new theory of mimesis, rooted in post-human sensibilities that will reinvigorate our understanding of the nature and function of the stage, the composition and performance of plays, the work of the actor, director, and designer, the body of dramatic literature, and the study of theater history. The chapter contributes to that task by touching on familiar theatrical notions of mimesis and blending them with contemporary counterparts from literary eco-criticism, philosophy, and science. It proposes that mimesis is more appropriately described as an activity that is co-produced in conjunction with non-human kin, and that its uses in a transformed theatrical milieu will lead to new understandings of performativity, storying, and ethical representation. By allowing the non-human their due as active participants in our creative and scholarly production, we reinvigorate mimesis's revolutionary potential and flood the stage with a host of collaborators from which to learn and with whom to interface. To demonstrate this as a possibility, I, Katrina, have co-written this chapter with my backyard crabapple tree, who in scientific language goes by the name Malus fusca. We begin the body of the chapter with a review of the struggles over mimesis that sit at the very core of drama and dramatic theory. This is capped with a suggestion that representation is not something that we do to reality, but rather something that the non-human does to us. Practices of making and knowing, including theatrical creation with its mimetic tendencies, cannot be fully claimed as human practices. David Fancy, our host today, glossing Gilles Deleuze, recommends repositioning that which is affected to become that which gives. A post-human mimesis will open us up to how our surroundings think through us. Historically, the non-human has been excluded from the rights and privileges of humans, and that includes artistic creation. As Donna Haraway notes, we've placed them outside the order of signification, included in the trading of signs and wonders. Assuming that the inanimate and the biotic could never participate in such trade commits once again the sure-to-be disproved error of gifting to humans special faculties that no other earthly inhabitants possess. It also keeps us lonely in our creation process. The chapter chronicles how the search for a new post-human mimesis is proceeding apace, touching on the work of Walter Benjamin, Elin Diamond, and from outside the theater, Ian McGilchrist and Janine Benyus. We look at the dual dangers of anthropomorphism and transcendentalism, but also suggest that inviting in the non-human will wildly disrupt our aesthetics, and that relaxing our vigilance around these tendencies may be a necessary step in a process of change. We assert that it is theater's embodied quality, its foundation in participatory oral expression, that makes the form so finely attuned to the revolutionary potential of imitation. As Elin Diamond says, the body is mimesis's force field. The actor's body holds the capacity to enter the meshwork, the assemblage, in an exchange of meaning-making with non-human others. The actor responds to the call, enters the entity being imitated or allows themselves to be entered, and pulls in the audience as well. Time and space are altered, and experience is exchanged in densely loaded packages of sensations, images, and ideas. A great example of what Karen Barad calls material discursive phenomena. Theatrical mimesis is being, thinking, and feeling all at once. As a tool to explore the post-human world, it holds unparalleled promise. So as we navigate what Catherine Yusof calls this epochal swerve, the theater will change as it has many times before. How it will change and how we will teach that change will decide whether the generation of Thunberg's school strikers will find value in learning our embodied mimetic ways, or whether they will avert their eyes from a Titanic theater plunging into oblivion, still dancing to the tune of its anthropocentric ways. Ian McGilchrist agrees that mimesis holds a roadmap for this change. The great human invention made possible by imitation is that we can choose who we become in a process that can move surprisingly quickly. His enthusiasm continues with a warning. We had better select good models to imitate, because as a species, we will become what we imitate. And that is all I have. Back to you, David.
Thank you so much. I'm really looking forward to continuing to unpack this whole notion of distributed agency that you articulate so wonderfully, the different notions of what constitutes agency, how participation occurs between human and other than human, the networks of complex relationality that then allow for story to be co-told, and the very moving notion of it's just lonely if you assume that the entire world is inanimate and has the incapacity for agency or co-creation. And so thank you so much for this really important intervention. Looking forward to the discussion shortly. We'll conclude the first part of our session with a presentation by Beth Osnes. She's an associate professor of theater. Welcome, Beth, at the University of Colorado in Boulder, and also an associate of the environmental studies faculty there. Beth engages in performance to co-author and actualize an equitable, survivable, and thrivable future for all life and the ecosystems upon which all life relies. She is co-director of Inside the Greenhouse, an initiative for creative communication on climate. Beth toured an original musical, Shine, to Rockefeller Foundation 100 Resilient Cities, to locations to facilitate youth voices in resilience planning, and published the book Performance for Resilience, Engaging Youth on Energy and Climate Through Music, Movement, and Theater. Beth's book, Theater for Women's Participation in Sustainable Development, includes her work specific to gender equity in Panama, Guatemala, India, Nicaragua, and the Navajo Nation. Thank you so much for joining us here today, and I'm really looking forward to your observations and intervention.
Thank you so much, and thank you to the other panelists. I start also by acknowledging that I am coming to you from the land of the territory of the Ute, the Cheyenne, and the Arapaho people. I further acknowledge that the 48 contemporary tribal nations are historically tied to this land that we now call Colorado. And I'm really interested in this idea of climate pedagogy. I've been teaching classes with a climate focus for many, many years, and experimenting and falling on my face and growing and learning and having a really good time with it. And I co-teach a course called Creative Climate Communication with my colleague, Max Boykoff at the University of Colorado. And with him and with two other people, Rebecca Safran and Phaedra Pizzulo, we have a interdisciplinary thing called Inside the Greenhouse, through which we do a lot of this work. And I'm really interested in this idea of enacting climate. And one of the things that I'm interested in is designing these kind of non-disposable assignments that can guide students in creating these kind of works that that put into action these things that we're talking about, that are fun, that are aesthetically stirring, that do that work of creating an equitable, survivable, and thrivable future for reversing global warming. And I'm interested in these activities, and I like to be sure that each one is grounded in the physical and life sciences. I like to be sure that each one is, the design of these assignments and these activities are informed by the social sciences, which include, education, anthropology, all the social sciences that have been looking at, effective climate communication, and then aesthetic strategies for socially engaged art, because we have more and more groups that are articulating this. I think of the aesthetic framework by Animating Democracy, such good, useful language for talking about arts that's socially engaged. And also I'm really interested in this idea of enactment through performance and policy, so that we're taking these communication, these artistic expressions, and getting them all the way to policy change. And I'm really interested in these things that can be disseminated openly. So I'm going to switch. I just want to share my screen for a second because this is such a visual thing that I'm sharing. So I just wanted to share out, let's see, I have to start this. Sorry, I should have done this already. Start from the start. So we'll go to the next one. So this is an assignment that I did this semester called Fashion Green. And it was giving students these green suits. Each student checked out a green suit. I've been doing this long green suit project through Inside the Greenhouse, and they were to visually communicate within their circle of influence how sustainable fashion can positively influence the environment and be aspirational, that you'd want to wear these outfits. And we brought in these concepts of being like that youth are trusted messengers within their circles of community. This is the social sciences telling us this is true. There are also social sciences telling us there's this power of 10. That's an appropriate scale at which we need to respond to the climate crisis. This idea of sustainable fashion, which is rooted in the sciences, aspirational climate action, and visual communication. And this learning goal is to have an experience of really having this fun, aesthetically experience of creating your personal fashion style that's sustainably sourced, that inspires sustainable fashion attitudes and behaviors in others within your circle of influence. So the thing that gets pretty fun is, this is the idea that I've been very interested in lately. This idea of enactment is acting out like what we do, like theater, but it's also, an act is to make law or legal, an authoritative act. And policy, if we're enacting policy, policy is a course or a principle of action proposed by a government that can be taken out by that can be acted out by a government, a party, a business, or even an individual. So we can be doing policy work even if we're just influencing other individuals. If your family takes on a policy of reducing meat consumption, that's a policy change. So we can have this performative enactment of climate supporting students in the enactment of policy. And these are some of the things that came from this. These are the compositions that these students enacted through their bodies. And here's one that shared out. If the garment industry were a nation, it would be the 4th largest climate polluter on Earth. Check out this completely resourced outfit and consider getting your next fashionable outfit from a thrift store. Please respond with a thought. And then these responses that came out. The thing that was super fun was we charged the students with reaching out to a minimum of 10 people within their circle of influence, because we are working with the power of 10, that's that appropriate scale that was based on an academic article. And here's one student who has quite a big circle. You can see here, he's already got 720 followers. And he did a thing on outdoor gear and how there's places that you can source it, that they will even like that, he has quite a good following. at the time of this assignment, you can see where my cursor is, he's reached 329 people with his communication, but by the end of the assignment, he had reported reaching over 700. So the thing that we get is these student compositions can go a long way in creating these non-disposable assignments. This is the next thing that we're doing in the same class that'll be coming up on Earth Day. We have our students working with 15 professional comedians, and we have the comedians coming in. Our students are acting like researchers, like dramaturgs for the comedy pieces that are all going to be based on drawdown climate solutions. And we had our first class with the comedians in there. It was a zoo and so fun. 15 professional comedians who are each being paid $300 each to come to our class, work with our students a few times, and then perform their pieces in our class that we'll record and edit into our show that we're going to be launching on April 1st. Excuse me, April 22nd. So I just wanted to share out a few, I'm out of time, but I wanted to share out just a few examples of these kind of assignments that put into practice these ideas that we're talking about. Thank you. Back to you, David.
Oh, let's everybody, thank you so much, Beth. And if all the panelists could please come back on, and we'll just move to this sort of the second part of our proceedings. But I'm struck, Beth, by the absolute sort of, again, this notion of creativity, of embodiment, and the work around influence. Also, this whole idea of enactment and representation, right? Both in a theatrical, but then that becomes a political sense of representation. So one is representative of not just adopting a costume or enacting a role, but that then has a representative function where one claims agency to represent something such as a policy. So we're not just giving power away to elected representatives, we are choosing the power to enact representation that is simultaneously theatrical and political, you know? So just to our audience, this is, now we're moving into a freeform session, and the only sort of suggestion that I gave that I seem to get consensus around with my colleagues here is that we perhaps take the opportunity to ask one another questions about our work or thinking, or ask each other questions more generally, with the hope that it will soon devolve into just a productive conversation for the remaining half hour that we have. And given the size of the issue, there's certainly no lack of things to discuss. I'm expecting that we should just relieve ourselves of any expectation that this needs to be linear or that we're systematically working through things. We might find ourselves recursively coming back through issues that we think we've discussed but then want to jump back to. So let's open it up with that spirit. I'm wondering if we might begin by thinking about ways in which, and not to focus on the negative, but the ways in which the kinds of work that each of us have been doing in various ways for some time and continuing to aspire to do, are there any institutional barriers, curricular barriers, disciplinary barriers? What would you describe, and I won't say, opposition, but it might manifest itself that way, but what are the interlocutors in your milieu, be they disciplinary heritages, institutional assumptions, the way in which departments, for example, in which we work, teach, live, and create are organized? What would you describe as being some things that you've come up against, and things that you are then, that then mean that you have to have creative and other solutions to sort of work with or move beyond? Any thoughts about that, anybody? And I think, hopefully we'll hear from everybody, but would someone like to start?
What comes to mind to start with is funding issues, of course, because within university settings, it's also like we look at sustainability and sustainable education throughout like the 70s. What is profitable is encouraged, unfortunately, in Western traditions. And if it's not, there's no profit there, that might become an obstacle in a way. So that's been a challenge for me to approach communities and connecting communities with universities, like university settings and educational settings. because, yeah, because of that.
Right, and so funding, just in terms of sort of the expectation that if, and I'm being really literal here, but and excuse me if I'm off base, but are you imagining sort of someone's proposing a production or a project that isn't immediately remunerative or doesn't have existing streams of funding available, then it's less liable to happen? Is that kind of thing that you're thinking about?
Exactly. If you do have funding, of course, there's funding bodies that you could reach out, but those might have restrictions. Those might have policies of their own and politics of their own. So you kind of are not, I mean, it's a question of how free you are then within those funding bodies to look at what you are doing. And if you're doing without like those funding bodies within university settings, then it's difficult to reach because nobody really has that kind of funding ready for your production or your project.
Well, and it's important that we've got right to the sort of issues around structural issues that are always tied into economics. Katrina or Beth, any thoughts about this or other kind of challenges or barriers that you're working through in your practice?
Well, maybe I'll just say that I'm extremely thrilled, and I really want to take your creative climate communication class. It sounds amazing. And I'm interested in how you went about formulating that class and what the mechanisms were to put something like that in place, because I can imagine the sort of interdisciplinary collaboration that it would require. I'm interested in how it's positioned within university departments and things, and I'd love to hear a little bit more about that. For my own experience, I do think there are some really tricky obstacles to overcome. I come from the not-for-profit sector where, you know, if you're trying to change something, there's a fair amount of flexibility. Whereas if you're trying to change something like curriculum in a university, like the snail's pace of that process is pretty daunting. And I did teach my first eco-critical theater class just this fall, and that was a wonderful experience in many ways. Though, you know, much of eco-criticism kind of flies in the face of traditional literary scholarship, and so many of the students in the class were English students and struggled with that step, that thinking piece. And so in the way that we as teachers are trying to scaffold the things that we're teaching on other things, I felt like, oh, there's a couple of scaffolds that are missing as I'm trying to place this as the next thing in their adventure of exploring things. So yeah, that was interesting. It was a new course in our sort of complement of courses, and there were things about it that were definitely challenging. So I'd love to hear a little bit more from Beth about how you've navigated some of the challenges of creating these unique courses that exist between things.
One of the ways that we've got funding for the first time. We've been doing it for over 8 years now, co-teaching this, and a few times we had to do it by ourselves. But what we started out with a grant to do it, and then we just started scheduling it at the same time and getting both getting course credit for teaching the course. And so that worked as a strategy. Not every university will approve that, but so we both, because I actually have lesser students, because to have a good experience in a practice-based course, we only have 45 students. And so environmental studies gets credit for 20 students, theater gets credit for 15 students, and then another thing, entity Atlas gets credit for, but we have those 45 students all in the same class. And that's one way that we've structurally overcome that. I have to say that the interdisciplinarity is so key to the work, because not only are the professors in this kind of living open dialogue of stumbling over each other and having to really be on your game because you're bringing together different disciplinary approaches, but the students are too. So we have theater students with dance students with, you know, environmental study policy students, or even, you know, science students that come to this course, and they think it's weird. And one of the obstacles I overcame was like being a little timid with the embodiment stuff. And I learned over the years, I just got to get it front and center every time, you know, bring out my kind of let's do it personality, and start out every class with warm-up activities, and just like make it, like this is the culture of this class. And then they're ready to go put on a green suit and go outside and, do these things that we always build in that critical reflection piece, and they start to critically reflect, and they're like, oh, I can actually see how this is an effective method for communicating climate beyond this, these other classes that I've taken, and, in addition, they're working with them. So I think that that's one of the obstacles, and really just overcoming it. But the interdisciplinary has also been a place where we've gotten funding. We've gotten an endowment, we've gotten the foundation for our university is interested in us because we are interdisciplinary, and they work to get us donations.
Because if we're good at one thing, and on some level as sort of the impresario in the tradition of the theater maker, of involving people in the events that we're creating, and you're extending that through social media, for example, those kinds of statistics, those kinds of visibilities, those are things that you can then bring to the table the next time you're submitting a grant application, or you're looking at, and again, this is managerial language, but key performance indicators, right, around the success and the outreach of your project, I had a question for Lara, just wondering if you could talk a little bit about your placement with Greenpeace and the International Center for Arts, and the ways in which you were using your practice and exercises, and how that got picked up by, there's this important kind of translation to be done. And I think, Beth's spoken about this, and Katrina's also spoken about this in specific context, but your context of you working with an activist core, or people with a sort of a sensibility around the issues from an advocacy perspective, how did you integrate the theater and social change tools, the applied theater tools, to help the individuals in those contexts understand that might be useful for them to pursue their goals, or perhaps discover complexities about their work that they hadn't realized? Like, what did theater bring to the table?
Well, that's a wonderful question, and it's very much related to actually my chapter as well, because it was kind of like a trial of what I'm talking about. And it was, to start with, very strange, because it was designed to be a theater project, and then it transformed into a Zoom storytelling project. So that was kind of like a major change in the structure. But at the same time, because it was such a chaotic times, participants were very much looking forward to the workshops. So I was really not expecting it to become central to them, but it did, because it carried an importance within a pandemic context in relation to climate crisis. Wildfires are there, we are here. So I mean, it was a really interesting timing in that sense. And what we did is, actually, we invited what we framed as knowledge holders. So we invited Audrey Siegel from the Musqueam Nation to talk, just to share her thoughts and ideas and her experience as a climate activist for such a long period of time. And then we invited a postdoc, Sarah, from UBC, from Environmental Sciences. And she also shared her experiences, her projects, and so on. And then we started to build stories inspired through what we heard from them. And it was a really engaging process. Participants were mostly from BC, but also a couple were from Turkey. So it was really nice that people were all over the place. Like, if we did have a physical workshop, that wouldn't be possible. Right. And then we started to build stories. So everybody started to work on their stories. It was almost 3 months. And yeah, now we kind of have over 10 stories that we're going to start sharing next month in various mediums. And yeah, it kind of became like an experiment to see what two-eyed seeing Etatmuk really is talking about?
Mm.
Is it possible to look from both eyes and, you know, to bring together both eyes without actually merging them, but to have both of them together?
Right.
So it was really engaging in that sense. Yeah, and it was a very new experience for participants who were from the age of 20 to 75.
Right.
Yeah.
It's interesting because I think this whole question of convergence of different ways of knowing, different epistemologies, and bringing those together, be it as sort of an interdisciplinary, the scientists with their perspective on empiricism, engaging with issues of embodiment, as Beth discussing, the English scholar student having to understand embodiment and theater differently, or as you're discussing sort of indigenous and Western ways of knowing. It seems that what we're talking about here in many ways is what's always already occurring in the theater, is the collision of a variety of different ways of knowing. The contextual, the critical, the social, the embodied. There seems to be sort of an intensification of that dynamic that has the ability to perhaps trip us up a bit, but then also open up spaces for increased, expanded ways of collaborating with people who might not otherwise have the skills or the language or the context or the reason to kind of work together. I'm wondering if we could, if there's ways in which we might think about different ways of knowing and the opportunities afforded there. And, again, to come back to this urgency, but yet non-urgency that I was sort of framing at the beginning, how the demands of the global climate crisis necessitate and ask and invite us to think about coping with different ways of knowing at the same time. Would anyone like to expand on that a bit? How that intersects with their work, or the future of their work, or what we think some of the challenges are happening?
I have a response to that. I just think my response to that is I feel like it's interesting because I feel like only in the last couple of years have I been doing more conferences where I'm with people who are in performance. I was thrilled to be invited to be part of the Canada Association for Theatre Research. And I feel like before that I was mainly at other conferences that had to do with the World Renewable Energy Forum and things that were more like sustainable development and climate related things. And it was really cool to come back and be more with people in theater and performance who are working on these issues. And I feel like when I was in the other world, and I did a lot of things with the Drawdown conferences, Drawdown Learn, which is Project Drawdown, and I love the work that they're doing. But when you when you're putting yourself a lot in the context of the sciences, you can get feeling like there's already that that hierarchy with the arts. And so you can get a little polite. And I think what I realized in coming back into more of the performance world and things is that I'm a little bit I was raised Catholic, so I'm a little bit polite, or I'd want to be nice. And I'm a woman, so I've been trained and cultured in certain ways. And I'm a little done being polite, making polite accommodations to a death machine. And I'm interested in diving down deeper in my excavation, and it's also that balancing of the fierce urgency of now, and we're in a hurry, so let's take our time and let's slow down, like that lovely book Playing for Time, which was so useful to me, Making Art as If the World Mattered, such a good book. And those kind of ideas of slowing down, getting rid of the violence of this kind of industrial push towards progress, and putting that thing into the work itself, into the process that is then part of the product, and going deep. And I'm doing it with these 10 young women this summer in this work we did last summer, in this deep interspecies friendship with barn swallows, and then up to other bird species. And it's just been a really interesting road. I'm kind of getting a little derailed in my answer, but
no.
Just this road of I'm done making polite accommodations, and how do we use performance as this holder, as this rehearsal for reality, and it is reality, as this way of forging this new way forward. And I found it so satisfying. And I think performance is the perfect method for doing this. It's the best. I feel a little zealous in this, that like performance is the best way to make a better reality for all of us, so that we can survive and thrive in an equitable way.
Yeah. Other thoughts about this important kind of the way in which the coming together of different knowledges or different ways of seeing is informing your work?
Well, I guess one of the things that I tried to sort of explore in my chapter is this idea that mimesis has always been radical, controversial, always had this ability to supercharge us, and that I feel like we just have to kind of rethink it and relook at what it actually is, and see the other participants in it and acknowledge them. And so it's, I go back, something that I say in the chapter is that, theater itself is as just this really good example of material discursive phenomenon. Like, we're doing all these things at the same time. The complexity of it is so dense that it's very difficult to even theorize. And in that complexity, there's a lot of opportunity to grab onto many strands in order to move forward with strategies and interventions. And so I'm kind of ranting now too.
Yeah.
It's contagious.
Yeah, I mean, and maybe Lara, if you could talk a little bit more, something that you triggered me to want to ask this question of all of us. But you said something about simultaneous ways of seeing that aren't collapsed. Right, and there's clearly a sort of a political anti-imperial overtone there, right? Because specifically the work that you're talking about, if we're talking about, what are traditionally anchored in Western or kind of have the residue of imperial or certain forms of supremacy built into those, despite perhaps in many cases their best intentions on one hand, and indigenous ways of seeing and knowing on another, the work of attempting to perhaps too quickly have those be a convergence to make for a one-eyed seeing, you lose binocular vision and a lot of perspective, right? Just to play with the metaphor a bit further. But I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the simultaneity of holding different perspectives at the same time, being able to hold their singularity without establishing a hierarchy. How do we have singularity without supremacy and hold these different ways of knowing and seeing? How does that come up in your work?
It's extremely difficult, and we don't know how to do it, because
Right.
we've never practiced it before. It's historically not visible to us yet. So we don't have the language actually to build on this. What we're doing now, or, every action that we take is actually build this new language. And it's very new in that sense. And what we tried, for example, in that project was to take very specific inspirations, to frame them very specifically within their context. So not to just extract what we find useful as artists within these knowledge systems, but to actually immerse ourselves within the context and what that context means to us. So that meant that was a new universe to engage in. A new universe it was for Indigenous knowledge, and participants were coming face to face with things that they haven't really thought about in the past. Or within Western knowledge, what was the relation of that? I think we kind of fall into this mistake, I guess, of comparing them. When we put two things together, like our Western minds start to compare them. So this says this, but this means that. So I mean, it's very difficult to kind of look from this philosophy, this perspective, and it's a learning process. And Indigenous ways of knowing has these practices embedded in their traditions, their ways of living, cultures, and ways of seeing. Their cosmology is based on this. So I believe that we have so much to learn and so much to here
Mhm.
to kind of understand how we can, if we can, take the Western out of our own minds.
There's something interesting there too about, and I think this has come up in a variety of ways. Beth, you talked about the project with the barn swallows being an interspecies friendship. And Katrina, you co-wrote your chapter in collaboration with the tree and spoke about that network of complex relationality that provided agency and authorship over to an other than human entity. And Lara, your work, as you talk about this two sort of bifocal kind of vision, embedded within that is the notion of potential authorship from other than human entities. My own work in geo-artistry, or the actor as the geo-artist, my sort of contribution to the volume talks a lot about how do we understand the co-creation of very long-term or short-term, but very long-term, 100,000-year-long performances in collaboration with landscapes, and understand that not only do other than human entities have the capacity for agency, but also the capacity to experience the aesthetic. Right, so that it's not just the human has the capacity to experience the aesthetic. How can we engender different perspectives on what constitutes value by recognizing that everything can't be objectified and reduced to its functionality, its economic resource value, in part because it has the ability not just to generate for human eyes, but to also co-create and experience beauty. I'm wondering if we could just talk a little bit more about this notion of co-creation, friendship, complex relationality with other than human entities from the kinds of work that we've done, or perhaps the kind of work that we feel that is left to be done, right? So we're forward thinking, because you're doing a project, then boom, 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 you're having thoughts about all the other ways in which this could play out. So where we've come from, but where we might think we might be going in our work and our thinking too. If we could all, maybe jump in on that. Would someone like to start?
I'd be happy to start.
Yeah.
I think of also expanding what I think of as a performance. It's not something I have to sell tickets to and have a poster for.
Mm-hmm.
I think of this past summer, our COVID summer, when we went full speed ahead with our work with the birds, with the young women.
Yeah.
And there was one session where we had done this intensive time with this one population of barn swallows over a bike underpass. And we had done that for several sessions, getting to know that population. We wanted to start branching out to other species. And we were simultaneously coming to know these birds through making puppets of them, these kind of big body puppets, costume hybrid things. And I had made these really high poles, like 25 feet high poles, and these turkey vultures. And we have a lot of turkey vultures, and there's this tree where they hang out. And I had been scoping it out in preparation for bringing the young women there one morning before the turkey vultures take off in the morning to go and hunt, or not hunt, but scavenge. Yeah. And so I had been going there several times to check out the population, that they were teenage boys who hang out in this one big pine tree up the street in Boulder here. And I'd been there a lot of times. And the morning that I arrived with the 9 girls and the filmmaker and my colleagues and the PhD students from evolutionary biology who were there with us too, we arrive and we have our big puppets, because we're going to be performing our puppets for the birds, and they're there, and their behavior was so different. It was so impacted by our presence and the number of people who were watching them. And they were, they were like riding those thermals right near the tree more. They were doing a thing which they do anyway, which is in the morning, they open up their wings so that the sunlight will kill the parasites in their wings, so that they're a little bit less encumbered by that. But the thing that happened, and then the way that the human community chimed in, like there was a guy who was there who was like, what do you do? Everybody wanted to know, what are you doing? Because we had these weird puppets and we're taking notes and we're talking. And so somebody's saying like, well, what are you doing? And one guy's like, well, you want to hear what I think? And we're like, sure. And he goes into this whole thing about being really against the birds. That like, he's somebody who actually tries to exterminate these birds and get them out of people's backyards because they puke up like after death. Like they're really like, they can really do some interesting regurgitations. And then there's somebody else who says that they like their neighbors who have great affection for these birds and like mark their seasons by when the birds return and when they go back. And so we just got, and then the police come, what are you guys up to? Everybody, there was this performance that occurred. And then we had this great experience of the birds, and then finally the birds left, and then we went into the graveyard and just did some of our own puppet manipulations to be responding to what they had kind of taught us through their flight. But that's that was one of the more interesting performances we did all summer, and it was spontaneous. It happened in this moment that was so cool to observe, and I feel like I'm more interested in supporting those kind of performative experiences in my career now.
Yeah, because there's been so many different forms of relationships are articulated, right? From extermination to sympathy, but then the fact that they're present with you with the puppets, they're necessarily going to start understanding the circumstance from the way in which you're inviting and proposing that people might enter into the relationship with this other than human collaborator, right? Yeah, it's really nice. Lara, Katrina, any thoughts?
Yeah, I have many thoughts, excuse me, about this topic. And one of the things that I hope or propose in my practically speaking part of our chapters, which I think was such an interesting exercise to give us, was the idea of thinking about what are your partners? What are your producing partners when you're actually making art, writing a paper? What other non-human entities are working on you? And so when I moved into this new house, I recently moved to Winnipeg. And one of the things that's been quite profound is the effect of this tree on me and my thought process and my whole being. And that's why I chose the tree as my partner, because I realized that so much of what I was going through or was in relationship to this tree. It has an enormous impact on my daily life. But I also think there are many lessons in the theater, in our practices, whereby we welcome in others, but we don't acknowledge that. Right? We think that we alone are doing it. And I think so maybe what I'm proposing in the practically speaking sort of section of the chapter is that by starting to acknowledge it or name it, it opens us up a little bit more to actually seeing and feeling what's going on and perhaps deepening that relationship. So I give the example in that section of actors saying, well, it was the costume that gave me the character, right? It was this fabric, the color of it, the way it laid on my skin, the feeling of it, and that's where I got it. And so in other words, it's fabric. It's whatever that is actually interacting with you to give you this representation. And that's just one example of, I think, a very complex matrix of partners through which we create, and that we start to see it as a collaborative process. And because I have a background as an artistic director, this idea of co-producing, which has been such a big part of my past, and there's been a lot of sort of discussion around what does co-producing mean and how is it done and what is it. I sort of chose that term to think about how we might actually be doing that. So how do we name what's going on?
Very nice. Lara?
Oops, sorry.
Yeah, I really relate to what Katrina is saying. And I also want to add that there is a huge urgency that is the climate crisis, which brings me to a point where I lose track of what is important. I'm in a panic state. My body changes, my feelings, my mind. So we are in an alert situation right now. So it is a matter of survival right this minute. But we need to kind of try to, I think, highlight and also build collaborations towards equity, in a sense that the global north is not actually living the reality of the global south right now. Yeah. So what is reality to us is something else. So I think these types of collaborations within the educational setting with community engaging the community and taking a step towards participatory action, like what Beth mentioned, the performativity within community settings and just the experience of it within the whole community is transformative. And I feel the urgency to need to build those connections, build those languages, and to move forward together, because it's too complex. Like we won't be able to do it on our own. We aren't able to do it in like our own frames. So if we attack it from complex perspectives without looking for one answers, you know, one right or wrong, I think we might be able to be in a sense within the crisis.
Yeah. As we move towards the end of our session, what I thought might make sense is, just given that we're talking about teaching and learning, and if there aren't students watching now, there may be, and certainly I'm thinking us and colleagues might use these discussions as resources for students to engage with in the future. I'm just wondering if we might finish with a bit of a lightning round of observations that we might give to students currently studying theater who are also very interested in and concerned about the climate crisis, the kinds of things that we might be regularly saying to students on these issues, or some direction or some thoughts or some encouragement. Does anything kind of come to mind? And of course, it's, you know, we're giving ourselves a brief lightning round here, so there's no way it can be comprehensive. But where might we start when we're beginning to engage students? Just, you know, a student who might come to us and say, theater, climate crisis, what gives? Any thoughts? Beth, yeah.
Yeah, I'd say that go where people are already gathered. Get into faith communities, get into schools, get into wherever people are already gathered. I'd say we don't have time not to be benefiting from the research that's been done on what makes for effective climate communication. There's a lot of pitfalls. We can get into this information deficit model thing where we think, oh, we have to throw more scientific information to people. That will surely change their behavior. And if we look to the social sciences, we see that that doesn't. It is, you know, long dead. So we really have to be benefiting from things like Connecting on Climate from Eco America. Really wonderful, succinct people that have brought together all the research, Creative Climate Communication, a book by my friend Max Boykoff, who's my close collaborator. Using these, we really have to go smart. We have to box clever. And yeah, we just have to find those non-traditional ways where people don't already have pre-established defenses, where there's already a wall built. Get around it where you're talking about fishing, or you're talking about maintaining the snow so you can keep skiing. You know, engaging it with, you don't even have to use the word climate or global warming. Maybe please don't.
Yeah, very, very wise thoughts. Katrina?
Yeah, just to carry on with that thought, just to say, stay close. There's a lot of things that are local to you and very close to you that you can use and be involved in and bring into the theater. So for example, here at the University of Manitoba, we've been trying to get composting going. I know we're way behind for so long. And there's a group of students that are working so hard on that. And it's hard. And so there's that to be involved with. There's another group of students that is growing vegetables in these old planters that the university has kind of abandoned around various sites at the university. And don't think that that work isn't theater or isn't part of theater, because it all is all part of this kind of nexus of, as we've said, enacting and rehearsing and agency and all these kinds of words that we've used, and that bring that work right back into performance. It's all part of it.
Perfect. Yeah, lovely. Lara, just in closing, some thoughts from you?
Yeah, I was that student. You're talking about me. So I'm an actor, I do performative encounters and so forth, experimenting things. And yeah, it just hit me, what are we going to do now? Like what does theater have to do? Like what can theater do? And then I ended up looking into applied theater. And what I am encouraging students to do is to not stop searching for what they are looking for, and to have a belief that they're not alone. And there are so many people, so many sources out there, and it's not only, it doesn't have to be local. They don't need to reach out to their own communities. The world is ours now, and we see how we take action when we want to. So I also encourage them, of course, to see from a systemic point of view that it's not only about what is seen on the stage, but it's more backstage, actually. So what is going systemically within community settings? What has been going on for centuries? The political arena, what is really happening gender-wise, racial-wise. All of these are interconnected. So I think it would be a great way to find kind of those connections and move forward, knowing that you're not alone and that there's a value in all that you do within communities. So yeah, I encourage them to kind of reach out and touch people.
Yeah, which with any luck will continue to be able to do both virtually and other than virtually. So just to thank us all, thank you so much for these rich discussion, for the very gratifying opportunity to talk about things collectively that are important for us in a way that helps communicate the work that we're doing and the complexities of it and the challenges, but also the many opportunities. So thank you so much for this participation, and we'll perhaps I'll say farewell to our viewers and be sort of available here in perpetuity as long as YouTube lasts, which is perhaps longer than many of us will. And looking forward to the rest of the weekend's discussion and the opportunity to work and converse with you all again before too long, I hope. Thank you so much.
Thank you, David, for hosting this.
No, my pleasure. All right.